What's at stake in these elections? Because Zimbabwe needs this vote to go well without any hitches to restore its credibility on the international stage.
Yeah, and of course there's a long and dark history of election violence here, Delano. Sporadic killings, beatings, abduction, intimidation. That was part of pretty much every election once the opposition emerged as an organized force in 1999. And repression during elections was one of the factors in the EU and the US imposing targeted sanctions on Zimbabwe in 2002 and 2003. Now, those sanctions, of course, have over time made it more difficult for Zimbabwe to access the international financial system. The US, in particular, is still taking a hard line. And in fact, at the beginning of this year, the US actually extended its list of Zimbabwean individuals that were being sanctioned, albeit with the possibility of a review after this election. So we'll see what happens then. And sort of at the other end of the scale among Western nations, you've got Britain, which is currently trying to rehabilitate Zimbabwe, so to speak, bring it back into the international community, back into the Commonwealth, and so on. But clearly, Western powers will need to be on the same page if there is to be a coordinated economic relief for Zimbabwe and a renegotiation of Zimbabwe's debt. That's why the perception of fairness or otherwise is so important in this election.
Are we likely to see this vote head to a runoff in September, or do you think one of the candidates will secure 50%?
You know, I don't want to speculate on who's going to win, but when we talk about these transitions, Delano, we're always, transitions towards democracy. One thing that always comes up is the role of the army, and I think that's an important factor here. When we talk about Cuba, for example, how far will the military, which has economic interests, how far will it allow market liberalization to actually happen? Because at some point, the interests of the military or interests linked to the military could be threatened if there's genuine economic competition. And this is a template that we can apply, albeit with a very different history from Cuba, to Zimbabwe, because at the moment we have two parties, and this is the interesting thing. Both ZANU-PF and the MDC have been running on broadly pro-market platforms in order to bring international investment back in. But what will entrenched interests actually do? Will some senior military interests, will they aid or hinder that process? From the military's point of view, Emerson Mnangagwa is at least a character that resonates because, of course, he's much older than his opponent. He's from that era of the struggle for Zimbabwe's independence. He became a minister in 1980, so he's very much of that Mugabe era. So he's someone that certain military people will feel very comfortable with. For Chamisa, if he wins, it's obviously going to be tricky in the sense that some military officers still can't conceive of Zimbabwe being led by someone who isn't a veteran of that struggle for independence.